Sunrise. I walked the vineyard rows my father planted before I was born, the fog still clinging to the hills. 3 weeks since we buried him, and I still expect to see him out here, sleeves rolled up, checking the vines like they were his own. Soft Vineyards was nothing when he started it. 40 acres of scrubland and a second-hand tractor. Now it's 400 acres, a tasting hall, a restaurant, and my name on the deed as CFO. I promised him I'd protect every. Half-sister Delphine came back for the funeral and never left. She took over marketing, all warm smiles and expensive scarves, telling everyone how good it feels to finally be home. I wanted to believe her. I really. Tuesday when I first noticed it, buried in the harvest invoices. A supplier called Vale Sourcing paid $80,000 for French oak barrels that, according to the seller log, never arrived. I told myself it was a clerical. And Theo runs day-to-day operations here. When I mentioned the invoice, he kissed my forehead and said accounting glitches happen every harvest. I let it go, but something about the way he said it sat wrong in my chest for days. Stayed up after Theo fell asleep, cross-referencing 3 years of supplier contracts against our bank statements at the kitchen table. 2 more phantom shipments surfaced. Same supplier, same missing barrels. My hands were shaking by the second bottle of wine I did. Sourcing had no website, no warehouse, no employees I could find anywhere. Just a bank account that received our money and a filing address that turned out to be a mailbox store 40 miles from here. Someone had built a company out of nothing but our. Found it. The filing paperwork listed the registering agent's maiden name, Vale. My mother's maiden name. Delphine's mother's maiden name. Not mine. A shell company named after my sister's own bloodline, hiding in plain sight inside my father's. Ended up at dinner, casual, like I was thinking out loud. Theo's fork paused half an inch above his plate. Delphine laughed a beat too fast and changed the subject to the harvest gala. Nobody asked a single follow-up question. That silence told me confront them again. Instead, I started making copies. Bank statements, contracts, old emails, backed up to a drive I kept in my car. Not the house. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was actually being careful for the first time in my father's old study. I found an unfinished letter to his attorney, dated 6 weeks before he died. 3 lines long. It mentioned irregularities in the sourcing accounts and a meeting he intended to request. He never got to. Doctors called it heart failure, sudden and unexplained but not unheard of for a man his age. I'd accepted that answer at the funeral, because grief doesn't leave room for questions. Now, alone with his letter, the questions wouldn't stop. Still synced to the estate system, showed a meeting the day before he died. Attendees, Theo and Delphine. Subject line, family matters, no notes, no follow-up, no record of what was actually said in that room. Digging through estate records, I found the ownership amendment. 6 weeks before he died, my father signed over an additional 12% of controlling shares to Delphine. The signature witness on the page was Theo. My husband had known about this the entire time. 12% doesn't sound like much, until you realize it was exactly enough to tip the board majority into her hands the moment my father was gone. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight, it was a plan. Executed with a notary present and my husband's signature as proof. I found Delphine in the cellar, checking inventory like nothing in the world was wrong. I asked her directly about the amendment. She tilted her head, told me grief was making me paranoid, and suggested I talk to someone about the stress I'd clearly been under. That night, Theo suggested, gently, that I take a leave of absence. For my own good, he said. The board had apparently already discussed it. I hadn't said a word to the board about any of this. Someone else had been talking for weeks. I realized then they weren't reacting to me. They were ahead of me, building a narrative brick by brick, turning my own instincts into evidence of instability. Every question I'd asked had apparently been logged somewhere as one more sign that Marin wasn't handling grief well. The board meeting lasted 11 minutes. Delphine presented printed emails, ones I'd never written, suggesting I'd misallocated harvest funds. Theo sat beside her, silent, nodding at the right moments. They voted 6-1 to suspend me, pending an internal investigation. 2 security staff I'd hired myself walked me to my car. Employees I'd known for a decade wouldn't meet my eyes. I drove past the gates I'd played behind as a child, watching them close in my rearview mirror. And I didn't cry until I was 3 miles down the road. My rented apartment in town had bare walls and boxes I never finished unpacking. I kept a photo of my father on the counter, the only thing that felt like mine anymore. Everything else, the company, the house, the story of who I was, belonged to someone else's version of events now. Old friends stopped returning calls within a week. Word moves fast in a small wine country town, and the word moving was that Julian Ashcroft's daughter had cracked under grief and started stealing from her own family. I heard it secondhand at a gas station from someone who used to work for me. A courier delivered a restraining order to my apartment door. I was no longer permitted on estate property, including the small family plot where my father was buried. They had taken the company. Now they'd taken the one place I still visited to talk to him. Through a contact who still worked reception, I learned Delphine and Theo were fast-tracking a sale, 400 acres to a resort developer, breaking ground on villas within the year. 40 years of my father's work, quietly being converted into a line item on someone else's balance sheet. I drove out to the small memorial marker in town, since I couldn't reach his actual grave anymore. I sat on the grass and told him I was sorry I hadn't seen it sooner. Then I told him something else. I told him I wasn't going to let them keep it. Grief had made me slow. Anger, it turned out, made me methodical. I stopped asking how they could do this to me and started asking a better question. What would it take to make sure they lost everything they thought they'd won, cleanly, with proof no one could spin away? I called Ines Calloway, the estate's bookkeeper, before she was suddenly let go 8 months earlier for reasons nobody explained well. We met at a diner off the highway. She'd been waiting, she said, for someone to finally ask her the right question. Ines had kept a backup drive from her last month on the job, an instinct she couldn't fully explain at the time. It held 2 years of raw ledger exports Delphine had since scrubbed from the live system. She slid it across the table like it was made of glass. Together, over 3 nights, we mapped it. Veil Sourcing was one of 4 shell entities, each skimming a slightly different category of spend, all routing eventually to a numbered account in a jurisdiction that doesn't answer subpoenas quickly, roughly $2.1 million over 3 years. I needed eyes inside the company again. Deacon, a junior accountant Theo had hired 6 months ago, had been quietly flagging odd entries to no one in particular because he didn't know who to trust. I found him first. Deacon agreed to feed me real, unaltered exports as long as I promised to protect his job when everything eventually broke open. I promised what I could. Mostly I promised the truth would matter more than his signature on any. Quietly, I also filed a formal request with the county to reopen my father's death file, citing a documented financial motive the original review never had access to. Detective Ruiz, a patient woman with 2 decades on the force, agreed to take a second look. The original toxicology report had flagged a compound as a likely interaction with his blood pressure medication and moved on. Ruiz sent it for independent reanalysis. Compounds don't lie the way people do. We just needed someone to finally ask the lab the right follow-up question. While the lab worked, I started attending investor mixers under my maiden professional name, Marin Vale Ashcroft, flattened to just M. Ashcroft, Consulting. Nobody there knew my face from the estate. I asked polite questions about the resort deal and wrote down every answer. I learned the developer's legal team required a clean third-party financial audit before the sale could close, standard practice for a deal this size. That single requirement was a door. All I had to do was make sure the right person walked through an intermediary. I passed the developer's compliance officer, 3 specific, verifiable red flags in the sourcing accounts. Nothing that pointed to me. Just enough truth to make a cautious lawyer nervous. 2 days later, the closing date quietly moved from weeks away to indefinite. Deacon told me the news landed hard back at the estate. He'd overheard Theo shouting behind a closed office door, something about how someone was tipping people off, and Delphine's voice, sharp and controlled, telling him to lower his voice before staff heard. This is small forensic accounting practice, freshly registered, got recommended to the developer's counsel as an independent auditor. Nobody connected the name to me, since I stayed listed only as senior reviewer, unlisted, buried 3 lines down on a cover page nobody reads carefully. For the first time in months, I had legal, sanctioned access to the estate's current financial records again. This time, through a front door nobody at Ashcroft Vineyards realized I was standing behind. It felt like walking back into my own house through a window I'd built myself. The audit trail, once we could see all of it at once, was almost elegant in its dishonesty. Doctored inventory logs, matched forged supplier signatures, matched wire transfers, timed suspiciously close to board votes. 3 years of theft, organized well enough that only someone who'd built the real system could unravel it. Deacon found something he wasn't looking for. A locked folder on Theo's desktop, labeled with my father's initials, J.A., last modified the week before he died. He copied it onto a drive with his hands shaking, certain any second Theo would walk back into the room. Theo did walk back in. 30 seconds after Deacon slipped the drive into his pocket and pretended to be finishing an unrelated report. Theo didn't suspect a thing. He just told Deacon not to stay too late and turned off half the lights on his way out. The folder held draft documents showing my father, 3 months before he died, had already discovered an earlier, smaller pattern of missing funds and had begun drafting paperwork to remove Delphine from the board entirely. He never got the chance to finish. Buried in the same folder were text messages between Delphine and Theo from that final week. Nothing that read like a confession outright, but one line from Delphine stayed with me for days afterward. We just need him to stop being so stubborn about this before the board meeting. I brought everything to Detective Ruiz myself. The folder, the messages, the shell company map, 3 years of doctored ledgers. She listened for 2 hours without interrupting once, then told me the independent lab had just called that morning with the reanalyzed toxicology results. The compound flagged as a medication interaction wasn't one. It was a controlled substance with no legitimate prescription on my father's medical record, present in a quantity inconsistent with accidental exposure. Ruiz opened a formal homicide inquiry that afternoon, running parallel to the fraud case. Now I had a choice to make. Let the legal process grind forward slowly and quietly, or force everything into the open before Theo and Delphine realized how close the walls had gotten and disappeared with what was left of the money. Deacon's next export answered the question for me. Theo had initiated 3 international wire transfers in 18 hours, moving what liquidity remained toward an account in a jurisdiction Ruiz's team couldn't easily reach. The window to act was closing fast. I decided on the Harvest Gala. 300 guests, investors, press, family friends, the same terrace where my father used to give his welcome toast every September. If I was going to take back what was his, I was going to do it in the one place he'd built for exactly this kind of gathering. The night of the gala, lanterns lit the vineyard rose in gold, and Delphine moved through the crowd as the gracious heir apparent, unaware the developers board had received our final audit report 6 hours earlier. Some conversations were already happening that she couldn't hear yet. Detective Ruiz arrived quietly near the back of the property, out of uniform, a warrant already signed in her bag, waiting on a signal we'd agreed on 3 days earlier. Nobody at the party noticed the extra sedan parked near the service entrance. I stepped onto the terrace where my father used to give his toasts, and I asked for everyone's attention. Not with accusations first, just with a simple slide projected behind me. A timeline, my father's face at the top, and the words Ashcroft Vineyards, 1987 to present. Slide by slide, I walked 300 guests through the shell companies, the doctored logs, the ownership amendment signed 6 weeks before my father died, then the final slide, the toxicology report, and one text message glowing in white text against black. The terrace went completely silent. Delphine tried what had worked before, her voice cracking just enough, telling the crowd I was still grieving, still unwell, still seeing things that weren't there. But this time, Ina stepped forward with the ledgers, and Deacon stepped forward with the folder, and the crowd didn't look away from them. Theo slipped away from the terrace toward the cellar entrance, moving fast and calm like a man who'd rehearsed this exit before. He came around the final corner, into the flashlight beams of 2 officers and Detective Ruiz, who simply asked him to stop walking. Both of them were taken into custody before midnight. Theo for fraud and obstruction, Delphine for fraud, forgery, and as of that week, as a named person of interest in a reopened homicide inquiry. The developer's representative quietly told a reporter the sale was, effective immediately, withdrawn. The trial took the better part of a year. Fraud charges resolved first, both convicted on the strength of Enos's ledgers and Deacon's testimony. The homicide case followed months later, built on the toxicology results and a jury that found the timeline impossible to look past. Delphine received the longer sentence. Theo's cooperation in exchange for a reduced charge told the rest of the story he'd never had the courage to tell himself. That he knew, that he'd known for years, and that knowing had never once been enough to make him stop it. Ownership of Ashcroft Vineyards reverted to me in full, along with an apology from the same board that had walked me off the property 14 months earlier. I accepted the apology. I did not forget who had voted which way, and neither did the company history I intend to write down honestly. Run compliance for the estate now, on the record this time, with a title and an office that has her name on the door. Deacon finished his accounting certification and leads the department he once quietly fed information from a desk he was terrified to lose. This morning, months later, I walked the same rows at sunrise, fog on the hills exactly like the day I buried him. I knelt at the edge of the eastern block and planted a new row of vines myself, the varietal he always meant to try and never got the chance to. I used to think revenge meant making someone hurt the way you hurt. I don't think that anymore. It meant closing the ledger honestly, every entry accounted for, until the truth was the only version of the story left standing. My father built this place on patience. So did I, in the end.